So it's a wonderful opportunity and a great pleasure to welcome Jay Leeming into the Fifth Direction today to have a chat. Jay's somebody whose work I feel like I know well. I've sat in plenty of kind of virtual spaces, listening to Jay with his performance storytelling and reciting his poetry, and it's always been a beautiful thing. And I've kind of had it in the back of my head to have a conversation at some point, and luckily enough, here we are. So welcome, Jay. And I wonder if I can start by kind of asking you, I guess, where you are in the world, just so our community can kind of orient themselves into where you are. And maybe I can follow that up by asking you, what are you currently creating? Like what's taking up your days?
Where am I? Well, I'm in my house, which I own with my wife. And we have a daughter. We live in Ithaca, New York, a college town, east coast of America, upstate, as we call it. It's about 40,000 people. There's crickets outside. It is September, which here is usually brisk and getting cold, but in fact, it's like a summer day today. It's hot. So it's the cool down of the night here, which I am enjoying right now. And the cicadas are buzzing in the trees. And yeah, that's where I'm at.
Mm.
Uh, I'm near 6 Mile Creek, a creek right here, a block away. Um, yeah, that's where I'm at.
And what's happening from that house? What are you currently creating at the moment, Jay?
Yeah, what am I creating? Well, gosh, I've been working on the Mahabharata this summer, which is a large epic from India. Just this gigantic, beautiful story. And I was recording it for a podcast, for my podcast. And recently, I'm sort of gearing up. I'm going to offer it online in September 20th. So today I was doing silly little internet stuff, just trying to promote that. And also just thinking of the story and pondering it some, and doing some music connected with it. So
Mm.
that's been on my mind recently. I'm also teaching storytelling to teenagers this school year, so I was working on that a little bit today as well.
Yeah, I noticed from kind of reading up a little about you, Jay. You've got your background's pretty amazing. I also noticed in there that you're a wilderness guide of sorts in the Yosemite. Is that how did that come about? I guess what I'm
Oh,
asking here, Jay, I'm going to ask you a bigger question and say, how did you get to what you're doing now? Let's go all the way back and let's hear about the Jay Leeming story.
yeah, the story. Wow. Let's see. Short answer, rock and roll poetry storytelling. That's the short answer. So I grew up in this town actually. And then left. I went to college for music. I was always telling stories as a kid. Imagination was always important to me, and a sort of almost a spiritual hunger to see the big picture. And being, growing up in America in the '80s, religion didn't really do it for me. I wanted the big picture, but it was sort of a spiritual urge. So I always was in my head a lot with imagination. When I became more adult, I moved to Minneapolis and wanted to play music. So was in rock bands for a while, writing songs a lot, playing smoky bars at 2 in the morning, which is good for your ego. Um, and slowly that turned to poetry over the years. The songwriting became poetry. I met Robert Bly, who became a great mentor to me and encouraged my work as a poet. And then there was about 20 years. Gosh, what a crazy sentence that you can say 20 years in a sentence. Such a big amount of time. For about that long, poetry was really my main thing, my main goal. And I had various day jobs along with that. And then at a certain point, I'm giving you the whole brief story here, Asher. At a certain point, that too began to feel a little small. Much as I love poetry, I was seeking a kind of performance aspect, and I was seeking a connection both to tradition and to what is sacred, I guess, in the world, which poetry can certainly have. But from where I've been standing, storytelling seemed to embody that in a bigger way. So I'm a daydreamer who found a way to make those dreams useful to the tribe. And I'm thankful for having those moments to give to others. I was never paying attention in class, and that's just the training you need for a storyteller in a way. Um, but performance is very healing for me for that reason, because you have to be connected both inside to the imaginative world, and then you have to really focus on what's happening. Is the woman in the third row falling asleep? Is, are people with me or not? So it's telling stories and poetry have both been ways for me to bridge those worlds and make things come alive for the community.
Yeah, I love that, Jane. And also you've woven your musical talents into it as well. So you almost become the complete picture there, you know. I'm going to admit to feeling jealous sometimes when I hear you tell stories, brother, because you have all those elements in the story. There's the guitar, and there's the poetry coming through, and there's the storytelling, and it's a beautiful space to be in. So thank you for your daydreaming, and thank you for the precious gifts that you're giving to the tribe.
Thank you, Ash. Thank you.
Mm.
Yeah, it's lucky. I like a lot of people, I didn't know storytelling was actually a path, really, that you could take in the modern world, until I met other storytellers. And even I guess even when when I ran into characters like Michael Mead, Robert Bly, Martine Frechtel, Martin Shaw, all these names, I I didn't quite take it as my thing. But you mentioned Yosemite. I married into Yosemite National Park because my wife had been a ranger naturalist there for many years. And when our daughter was born, she could not continue that work unless we all went. So I went, and a way to be useful there was to tell stories, which, of course, at a campfire in the wilderness is a terrific place for story.
Oh yeah,
So that
yeah.
opened me, yeah. So that
Mm.
opened me to the possibility that you can do this as an adult, and you can give to the community in that way.
Yeah, I hear that often. You probably do too, Jay, that, a lot of storytellers are like, I didn't realize that I was able to kind of do this, for a quote unquote living. And the other thing that I note too is a lot of storytellers that I know and that I've spoken to actually came from a musical background. I mean, you mentioned Martin Shaw; he's one, a sort of punk rocker turned storyteller. I wonder if it's a, you know, I'm not really saying natural path, but if there's kind of a progression there somewhere, which kind of begins with a beat, with a rhythm or something.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. The beat and the rhythm and the story. I mean, a song is generally we perceive song dramatically, no matter who it is. I mean, it doesn't have to be a musical. It can be any sort of song, and it's like a dramatic situation is speaking to us. So yeah, there's some connection there. And as you kind of were getting to, I mean, it's the bardic path, right? I mean, you get your music, your poetry, and your story, and all three of those worlds speak to each other and nourish each other in a very beautiful way. So,
Mm. Yeah, no, I love that, and I know I have to ask you the question, but that interaction with Robert Bly, kind of tell me how that happened. Tell me how you came across Robert, and what that meant for you, and anything else that comes up around that piece.
yeah. Well, let's see. I was in my mid 20s and playing rock and roll and in a very studious way, Asher, I should say. I was not very hedonistic. I would get up and I would write songs and then go to my job, either working for Greenpeace, the environmental group, or taking care of mentally disabled adults. And I would play rock and roll in these bars, and I would work my way up the week slowly from Tuesday to Wednesday. And somewhere in there, I had a dream. And in the dream, Robert came to me and asked to see my poetry. And I couldn't find it in the dream. I remember I looked under my bed. It was just not in the house. And Robert, to me at the time, was just a famous person who I had not read. I didn't know his books. I really didn't know who he was, except my unconscious sort of took hold of this, famous poet living in the same town as me. So I woke up and I was like, well, clearly this is important and I should make a little book of poems and give it to my friends. That's what I did because I was writing poems at the time. In the end, though, 6 months or so later, I was like, well, what the heck? He lives here. Let me mail it to him. So I sent it to him and he responded very kindly with a letter praising my work and then sought him out, actually, and connected. went to his men's conference, happening in Minnesota. Um, somewhat reluctantly at first. It seemed like I was in a different headspace. I was like, oh gosh, what is that strange gathering in the forest? Um, but I came to know him, and as it happened, he did not live far from me. So spent a lot of time with him, and he was a great teacher for me, both in the sense of just specific teachings about poetry, but just as a path, similar to what we said about storytelling. He showed me you could walk this path of creative work as a poet and be in the world and survive and live well. Not live well in that you own 3 cars, but live well, live a soulful, beautiful, fierce and rowdy life, which certainly Robert did.
Wow, that's an amazing story, man. The dream and everything like that. Particularly if you weren't sort of overly you knew who he was. You weren't overly invested, and you weren't besotted with his poetry at the time. Or it just came through. That's pretty special.
Yeah, I'm grateful for that. I guess if I had any part in it, I'm grateful. Like I wasn't working at 8 a.m. in the morning. I was in a state where I could remember. I was in a state where I was paying attention to my dreams, and who knows how many messages I might have missed in my life. We all might miss, but that's one I received and acted on, which is
Mm.
probably the most important thing.
A little bit of cinder biting going on, dare I say it?
Cinder biting. Yes, yes. You mean in the sense of being playing those bars at 2 in the morning, that type of thing? Do you mean?
Oh
Or
well, also in the I guess the Martin Shaw idea of the cinder biter who's kind of lying around in front of the fireplace, getting covered in ashes and daydreaming, and this is when we're open to these messages coming through. I guess
yes,
maybe
absolutely.
a time in your life like that.
Yeah. And looking back, I was seeking, well, not just a mentor, I was seeking a future. I wasn't thinking about it consciously, but I was like 26. I had a band, which was actually pretty good. At first, I was bad. At first, I wrote bad songs. We all need to do that. But I was actually writing good music. But I was sort of unconsciously seeking, like, where does this go? And if you're not super famous, there were some blues fellows in Minneapolis, oddly enough, and I would go see them every week. They were like in their 50s, and I think I was unconsciously seeking, where does this go? And,
Mm.
and Robert was suddenly like, wow, oh, this is where it could go. I know.
Yeah,
Um,
he has this way, and I keep hearing this over and over again. He just like you wrote to him, he wrote back, and he just opened his arms and took you in and embraced you. And he has this way about him, I think, about being very. It just seems that he's given a lot of people, you know, I guess a step up or an opportunity to kind of look ahead, and he's helped them in that process.
yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, fierce and generous. And as he in his life, I think he was fierce early on. Like he could be mean certainly early in his life more, but very generous. Martine Prechtel said once that Robert was a finder of lost things, and I think that's true in his work in terms of finding poets that we didn't know about, from other countries here in America, and also just for people, just as you said,
Mm.
finding people and bringing them into a community.
So a finder of maybe you're a lost thing.
Well, I think so. I mean, that's the thing. I was in my 20s, not sure where I was going, and
Yeah, like
and
many of
looking
us,
back,
brother. Like
yeah,
many of us,
exactly.
I remember myself. That's interesting. And Robert Bly as a teacher, I've often heard that kind of gruff but generous kind of idea. And to me, a lot of great teachers I feel are like that. They're like, look, my door is always open. Come and take a seat, but careful what you wish for.
Right, right. That's what yeah. I mean, Rumi talks about that, right? When we pray for such a teacher or something like that.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, he does. That's true. Um, so you talked about the men's work side of it. So I guess that was kind of a side effect, I guess, in terms of meeting Robert as opposed to something you're actively looking for. Would that be right?
That's absolutely right, Asher. Yeah, it's funny. I look back, I mean, the men's work, I just needed like anyone, any male could use it. I wasn't seeking it out. And I think for years, sometimes I denied. I was like, well, I'm here as a poet, I'm just not really all the psychology stuff. Like, I don't really need that. That's all. But in fact, of course, it was tremendously nourishing and healing to be aware of all those issues and things. I mean, I'm 53 now. I'm married. I have a child. I mean, wow, though that sort of soul work, that sort of just active awareness of men's work was very helpful to me. So,
Mm.
so yeah, I wasn't specifically seeking it. I was it was Robert as a poet who I was seeking, but there was a amazing side effect that I'm very grateful for.
Yeah, because you've obviously been kind of a long time figure, I guess, in the Minnesota Men's Conference. I remember seeing a video just recently of you guys out at that was it West Devon. Was it an event
Yeah.
that Martin Shaw took you guys? And I was looking at sort of pictures of others. I think Timothy Young's in the frame and Thomas
Mhm.
Smith and boy oh boy. Firstly, you guys look very young, but it also made me realize just how long you've all been at it. You know.
Yeah, yeah. And Tim and Thomas, of course, are a different generation from me and you, and they were another step on the ladder. So it was cool to hear their wisdom as well. Yeah, that was a wild tour that Martin Shaw, bless his heart, put together with Thomas, Tim, myself. Danny Deerdorf from Washington State, Joya Timpanelli as well, and Robert. We all kind of went through England doing various gigs. Quite an
Wow, that's a
experience.
that's a merry gang. I wish I'd been there.
Yeah, yeah, it was a good time. It was great.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And when I look at the work that you do, Jay, you often bite off these really massive stories and canons and I remember listening to the Odyssey recently and I feel like you have how does that process work for you? I think because that for me would be it's a very challenging undertaking.
Do you mean how do I sort of achieve that? Like, what's my path to it? Pretty
I guess
much.
I'm asking that, but also like the calling to kind of take on these giant
Mhm.
storytelling projects, I guess.
Yeah. Well, from a young age, like a lot of people, I was deep under the spell of story. I mean, and the stories available to me were books and pop culture. I mean, honestly, I mean, I'm not trying to. We're not in some kind of sacred space here, but I remember being in a car trip with my father, and it was sort of a long trip, and it's boring. And at one point, he asked me, he said, "A penny for your thoughts, Jay," which was a kind of a scary conversational tool I didn't know existed. And but I was honest and I said, well, Dad, I'm actually remembering every scene in The Empire Strikes Back, from the beginning. And I remember that now. And it's sort of like what I said earlier. I can criticize myself for being such a daydreamer, in the spell of this pop cultural thing. But again, as a storyteller, that's exactly what you need. I mean, you need to remember the Odyssey step by step. And when does this happen? When is the Island of the Winds? And when is the Cyclops? And when does he get the bow? So that type of visualization was something I've done for a long time. But I want to get to the basement of your question. I want to get to the heart of this question if I can. The calling, yeah, I've always loved those big stories. I mean, an epic is it has been said that the job of an epic poet, an epic storyteller, is to join heaven and earth. To join the activities of the unseen powers, the gods, what else? Who knows? The spirits with the actions of humans. And I think I find that unity in epic more than I do in some other kinds of stories, more than in folk tales for sure. Now, fairy tales are a category all their own, and they have all those elements as well. But there's something about the marvelous dailiness of an epic. Telemachus put on his sandals. He went out and got in his chariot. And then these totally insane other realms of the gods and the powers, the land of the dead. So I seek to weave these together in my work and of course in my life, because I seek to live in a world with depths and heights, and you can drive yourself crazy. Every glass of water you drink, thinking of Poseidon and the depths of the sea. But you can also drive you crazy never thinking of that and living in a world entirely flat and empty. So, more practically, more specifically, I began with fairy tales, and then I told Gilgamesh, which I was attracted to for many reasons. Just the angles of like destroying nature and wrestling with that, all the current events in this 4,000-year-old story. But Gilgamesh, just to get technical for a moment, every element in it falls like dominoes falling over. It's really great. It just flows from the beginning to the end. So even though it's quite long, it's not too hard to tell. And well, okay, it's difficult to tell, but it's not too hard to put it all together. Then I moved on to the Odyssey, just because that's a story I had come to know pretty well. And I identified with that story in many ways, seeking a home, finding a place where I'm rooted. And then the Mahabharata has called to me just because it's bigger still. And I don't want to make it sound athletic, like I'm just looking for the biggest story possible, but big, not just in length, but big in the scope of it. The Mahabharata brings in the sacred in a very deep way, differently than the Odyssey, and it questions violence and the actions of the gods, even in again, a very intense way, which I have long been drawn to. And that's a story I first ran into 20 years ago, and I'd always wanted to tell. So, yeah, so that's kind of what's called me to those big stories. I think at heart, it's this desire to live in communion with these unseen greater powers, whatever they are.
Wow, there's a lot of beauty in that answer, Jay. I'm just kind of soaking it in for a moment because I'm really feeling that. And I love the way you just make all that stuff available too. I mean, people can really dive in. It's not just a matter of going and listening to a 20-minute story. You can really go and find yourself. Well, at least I have, like, coming back and back every day for a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more, and it feels like a complete meal, not just a little kind of bite-sized story snack.
Yeah.
So.
Well, the pandemic brought me into Zoom storytelling, of course, and none of us love Zoom, but it's an episodic thing. A lot of these epics, so an hour a week, it works pretty well, really.
Mm, mm.
Um, I mean, I'd love to tell the all-night Odyssey, in the middle of the summer where we begin at midnight and go till dawn, but getting a community to do that is harder these days than it was 200 years ago. So.
Yeah, no, I absolutely feel you. I know Martin Shaw from time to time, doesn't he? Sort of gathers the community and tells these giant stories that go for days. And I always feel something in my heart. It feels like the right thing to do. But you're right, it is very difficult to do these days, right? Mm.
Yeah. I told the Odyssey this past season in the winter over 3 days, 3 nights. It was 2 hours each night. And we did it mostly in the dark, which was fascinating. So
As in pitch black or
that was the goal. Yeah. A lot of the more terrestrial, I should say, the more everyday moments were with the lights on. But as soon as Odysseus started telling his story, because of course, he hears his story told by another bard and weeps because of the sorrow of it, hearing the names of his friends who died in Troy, and he was actually there, right? So and the king at the time is like, well, why are you weeping, stranger? And he's like, well, I was there. This isn't just a story. I saw these people die. And he's like, who are you? And he begins to tell his story. So as soon as we went into that, we darkened the lights in the theater, which probably broke a few fire regulations, but just getting it as dark as possible. And with music as well, I had 6 vocalists with me, which was a delight. So that made it very intense, and you can really see things really clearly, oddly enough. I sort of missed not getting to wave my arms around and have everybody see, but we did that. That was over 3 days. And so all of his journey, his journey to the underworld, the Cyclops, all that stuff we did in darkness. And then when we returned to the island of Ithaca, we brought the lights up again. So that was a beautiful way to get the story out there into people's lives and their hearts.
That's amazing because by kind of taking away the the senses, the horizontal senses, I guess you're way more into that active imagination space, aren't you? So I think from that point of view, there's something very special going on there too.
Yeah, it pushes it towards ritual somehow as well. Like you're here, it's well, like you said, it's happening internally as
Mm,
well. It's
mm.
like energy work, it's like body work, acupuncture, massage. It's like it's internal as well as because though these stories do work internally, it is easy in today's world. I'm just going to the theater, I'm just seeing this thing over there. It's not happening in me, Athena, Zeus, whoever. They're not really, they're not present for me. But in the dark, it made it more immediate, I think, as long as you keep them awake, and I've tried to be engaging
Well, you
enough.
wouldn't know at that point unless someone's snoring.
That's true. That's true. Although someone pointed out maybe if I did it enough, I could sense, when they're. It was true. My hearing was so increased. The sound check for the second night, I was playing the drum, and I was like, "Wow, this doesn't sound anything like last night." And it's because after an hour in the dark, your ears are fully awake, in a different way. So.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, the third ear, so to speak, or the Hermes ear, as
Mm,
I've heard Martin Shaw refer to it. Yeah,
absolutely.
that's wonderful, man. And I guess could sort of sidestepping for a moment, I'm also I'm a great listener of Crane Bag, your podcast, and I kind of wonder that's a different medium again. So I'm wondering if you can kind of speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Like a lot of folks, I was reluctant, because storytelling is so immediate and it's so low tech, right? You just get a man or a woman ready to tell a story, and they can be in a field. If there's a blackout, if you run out of power, that's good. That's what storytelling wants. So I was reluctant to record them. Also schooled somewhat in the sacred by folks like Martine Prechtel. I was reluctant to stop this flowing river, this kind of crowd of butterflies, which comes weaving through the day, which is the story, and to like freeze it. But I saw that I could connect with people, and especially with the pandemic, of course, it became a means to bring story out into the world. So
Mm,
I'm grateful for it. And yes, it's one thing is it's an opportunity to really tell it as you want to, regardless of the audience. And that's both its curse and its blessing. It's the curse because there's nobody there. It's me in my attic with a microphone. But it's a blessing in the sense that you can really just get the words right, because it's a storyteller's job to not just tell the story, but to fit it into the life of whatever's happening right there for those people in that room. But in a recording, you can just sort of spin it out as you wish. And there's a few times where I've gotten a little obsessive about, editing out the coughs or whatever, the sneezes from it. But yeah, it's been a good medium for that, so for getting the story out.
yeah, I like it. And I love the little your own flavors which you put on these stories too, which I find comes through in the Crane Bag. We listened to as a group, we listened to Orpheus the other day, and there's that's a story. You come in at a certain place and you leave it at a certain place because there's a continuum there, but you also you've put your own there's clearly your own experiences and your own understandings in there as well. And I love that. Like it gave us something really fresh to talk about, even though I'd say like most of the people that were listening knew the story, but we were able to kind of weave into a completely different conversation based on the way you told it. And I really enjoyed that.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I got my practice on that story telling it in Yosemite at the end of an astronomy program, out on the granite rocks up at 9,000 feet in the mountains. And it was great because you could point to the constellation Lyrae, which is the lyre of Orpheus, like right there, above our heads. And it was really great. But something you said there made me think of just how story leaks into the world. We kind of are used to compartmentalizing things like, oh, I went to see a movie and then the movie's over. And stories in movies can run into your life too, of course. But there's something about story, spoken story, which really it flows into your life and out. And maybe you've heard this from other storytellers, but it just so often you find yourself like really standing in the story, like whether you knew it or not, suddenly you're there. I was telling a story from the Mabinogion with or Powell with his bag. He has to wander for a year with a bag and live off only what people put into the bag. And the next morning, I was walking around my block, and there was a bag from McDonald's in the middle of the street, and I had all these honest thoughts, which I'm not. Well, these thoughts, which I'm a little ashamed about, actually, but I'll just say, I was like, well, if I pick it up, people will think I'm eating at McDonald's all the time, which I don't want to be seen. So I felt sort of this shame, which of course is exactly what Puech or Powell feels in the story. And I went and picked it up because I was like, I'm going to clean up my neighborhood. And then I was walking with it, and everybody's like, well, what did he do? What's he eat? So there, and then the story came to me in a moment. I was like, wow, I'm just like that guy with the bag walking around. So
Wow.
anyway, that's a bit of yeah, it's a digression, but these stories leak into our lives, and we find ourselves in them often.
Yeah, I love that, man.
Yeah.
I'm immediately seeing the McDonald's bag as like the Firebird feather. You can pick this up and you will no trouble, my friend.
Yes. Yeah. Right. Right. So it is.
That's
And
very
we
cool.
can do nothing else.
I guess that's connected, Jane, into a kind of question about um as these stories come to you, deciding, is it a decision? Well, maybe you can tell me about which ones you're going to tell and which ones you're just going to listen and say, hey, that was nice. I'm glad that's in me, but not for me to tell. And how do you discern the difference? And then I guess secondary to that, what's the process from there?
You mean how do I choose which stories to tell? Pretty
Yeah,
much.
is it a choice or are they
That's a
choosing
great.
you?
That's a good question. Yeah. Well, I'd love to say they choose me, wouldn't I? I mean, that's the answer. That's the poetry answer, right? I just sit here and I have a vision. But of course, as you can expect, it's all manner of things. The world is complicated, and often I'll find myself in a situation where I need a story for something. I have made it a practice recently to tell stories in the kindergarten of a school near here. For like in the school year, for like 8 weeks, every Monday I go, and they're young. They're quite young. They're like 6 years old, and it's like a Zen thing because you have to like really know the story. If you lose it, if you suddenly are like, I don't know what happens, they're so distractible. They're playing with blocks or running around. So sometimes I'm in a situation like that, and I'm like, oh, I need a story. So it's a combination, Asher, I think. Like some stories I have sought out, some have crept up on me, I think. The Odyssey did creep up on me. I started telling the Proteus episode from that story. And again, to kids, actually, because it's got the changing man, Proteus, who changes into all these animals. And that's very exciting. Magic works for kids and adults too in a deeper way. So I started with that. And then I was like, well, I could add a little more here, and pretty soon I might get the whole thing. So it's a mixture of conscious choice and being chosen, I think. And sometimes things drop away, because I've done this enough, I can do the work and learn a story. But sometimes later on, I'll be like, well, a month later, I was like, well, that was cool, but it's not really, maybe it's not mine to tell. Maybe it's not a story that stays with me, that goes deep for me. So.
Yeah, I think that last part's interesting for me too. Like, it's a mixture between kind of an inner knowing and an outer kind of more functional, like I need a story type feeling. And then it's a dance between those two things for me. But I've heard, there's a number of stories that I've heard, which I adore, but there's an immediate sense of that's not for me to tell.
Yeah.
And
That's so wonderful that you can hear that voice, Asher, so clearly. That's cool.
mm, yeah.
Yeah.
So sometimes you want to because it's there's the ego gets in the way, of course. It's like I
Yeah.
want to be telling that story, but there's for me there's something deeper which I need. I feel like I need to honor. It sounds like it's the same for you.
Well, I felt this with poetry as well. I would get a plan, the mind makes plans. I would write whatever. I'd write a good poem about something that I don't know, some theme or something like that, about a river. And I'll be like, oh, my head will make a plan. I'll write 6 of these. They'll all be about rivers and it'll be a big sequence. But it's just not there. It's like that lightning struck once, but you can't really depend upon it. You have to dance to somewhere else to run into that lightning again, perhaps.
Yeah, there's something in there about the presence of the muses, isn't there? You can't kind of call them in on demand.
Yeah. And
Mm.
psychologically, that's a very healthy place to be where you are relying on them and it's not all you. Because if it's all you, it gets quite overwhelming.
Mm.
So
I think we find that like taking it back to I guess I'm thinking about musicians, but it could apply to anything. It's like if you have a successful, I guess, book, album, anything, then all of a sudden the external pressure is on for you to reproduce something amazing. And I often find that, the second book or the second album, maybe, it's not quite so good because there's suddenly there's external pressure on to perform again with something creatively new. And it's a very difficult thing, it feels to me.
yeah. And the process of learning a story is that combination as well. Because I mean, I find a story I like, and I start telling it. I read it a bunch of times, and then I tell it to myself. I go up in my attic when my wife and daughter aren't around, and I just say it into the dark. Which can be kind of lonely sometimes. You're like, wow, it's like breaking trail through snow or something like that. It's like, wow, I'm just slogging through this story. Sometimes I actually imagine an audience, if that helps, or a specific audience, like a friend of mine who's not there, I want to tell it to. And then I usually, as they say, take the story for a walk. I tell it out in the world as well. So all of that is it's like the musician doing the scales or just playing the song over and over again. But as we know, you can play a song or you can just really play the song. Something can happen, something can come into you from outside. And so in many ways, that steady work of walking the path makes that visitation from unseen powers more possible.
Mm. And when you say taking the story for a walk, Jay, do you mean telling it to the trees, telling it to the stones, or telling it to a selected group of humans?
Well, I guess when I say taking the story for a walk, I mean literally going for a walk and either thinking it through, depending on my mood, or sometimes telling it to the trees, sometimes telling it actually in the wilderness as a gift, which both Martin Prechtel and Martin Shaw have, from them I've learned that awareness of story as a gift and something which is innately a part of a larger world. It's not just the words in the book. It's like an animal, it's something breathing behind the words, some sort of river flowing there. And so to tell that story is to be in communion with those powers. And so when I get the chance, I try to do so directly. But often
Yeah.
it's just thinking it through, to be completely honest, walking around and I'm just thinking, oh yeah, and then this happened.
Yeah, I know that feeling as well. It's sort of like you almost, yeah, you kind of, then you look up and you realize you've walked somewhere completely unknowingly. That's happened to me a number of times. It's like, oh, I'm here now. Okay.
Yeah, you're here and you're here. You're in that
Yeah, yeah,
story.
yeah. It's
Um,
fascinating. I'm reminded, Jay, of a particular teacher. Storytelling is part of his repertoire, and I was hearing from a friend that went to one of his retreats. Say it's a 4-day retreat, and as they met the night before, and he said, "Okay, tomorrow morning we're going to go out to the sunrise and listen to a story." And so they went out very, very early, and he turned his back to everybody sitting there and told a 2-hour story to the sun.
mm,
And I just thought that
wow.
was really beautiful. And, I guess from the point
Yeah.
of view of a participant, entirely unexpected, thinking you're going to get a story told to you. And in fact, it's the reverse.
Right. Right. You were part of giving this gift to something else. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was a story about the sun to the sun, which I thought
Mm,
was just beautiful.
that's lovely. Wow.
Mm.
Perhaps I should say also I've put the Odyssey on a walk around my not neighborhood, larger than my neighborhood, up this hill. I live on the edge of this hill, and I've sort of placed the story in the land there as a memory kind of way, and that's a mix of the methodical work and the inspiration because sometimes life crosses it. And what I mean by putting it in the land is like as a walk I take often, and I just this is the part of the story where Odysseus sails to the island of the winds, for example, when I cross this bridge. And but sometimes the world just talks to the story in these kind of perfect ways. There's this little hill, which is usually where I get to the land of the dead part, and he's talking to everyone there. He's talking to Anticlea, his mother. He's talking to Tiresias, and then he talks to Agamemnon. And there's an old sign for a power company right there. So, for me, I mean, Agamemnon's Mr. Power Guy, right? He's the head boss man. So that's totally it. And then I go past this school and along another block, and there's a little sort of donation shack there for clothes, giving clothes to the poor. And that's totally Eumaeus's hut, the swineherd. I'm like, oh, that's where he lives. I was looking for a place to put it. And then I went around the corner. I was like, oh, that's totally it. Anyway, I take that walk sometimes, and sometimes I'm thinking about a totally different story, but it does help keep the Odyssey, one of many stories, awake for me to find it in the land there.
Oh man, I love that. That's a beautiful process, and the way these things just keep showing up for us, it's I think once you're in that world, that kind of mythic understanding, you realize that's of course, right? Of course,
Mhm.
that hut's going to be there. Of course, that sign's going to be there. It's just that the way it is.
Yeah, right.
I love that. That's so beautiful. And man, are you still writing poetry? Is that something that's still happening for you, or is that?
Somewhat. It's happening less, to be totally honest, but it is happening. Um, you know, I with story, it's like you publish the poems right away. It's great. I mean, if you have a gig, if you want to write a poem about the stars, in the night, it's just like you just put it in the poem, whatever. I mean, Gilgamesh or whoever, is walking along, and then you see the stars. You can just make it up, and there it is. So poetry seems kind of like a lot of work sometimes to write it down, to type it up, send it to someone. But poetry does happen to me still. Sometimes, certainly in the stories, and then also on paper sometimes as well. So I just had a third book come out, I guess it was last year, right? Called To a God of Dribble Glasses and Loneliness, filled with these long crazy poems, which were really moving towards storytelling, I see now. And so I'm working on poems for a fourth book at some point.
Mm.
Um, but they're so related, these two things, that, yeah, it's a different, they're very close in the landscape of whatever, the soul. So,
Mm.
um,
Mm.
yeah.
Absolutely. I'm now. I feel compelled to ask the question about the title of that book. What's behind that? The last book. It's a great title. It rolls off the tongue, but I'm sure it's got a story of its own.
Thanks. Well, Rimbaud, the French poet, has this famous thing he said, where he said, I mean, he said it in French, which I'm not going to do, but he said basically, "I is another." When I use the word "I" in a poem, it's somebody else. It's not me. And I climbed into that expression of his and just started writing poems as if I was a Sufi mystic, or as if I was a rock star, or as if I was in this case, a comedian on death row in some unnamed country, contemplating his life. So I would just spin off these wild kind of narratives, and I did write a poem about this imaginary comedian who got the Nobel Prize for comedy, and then did lots of work in refugee camps, making people laugh, and then ended up on death row contemplating his life. And he imagines speaking to a god of dribble glasses and loneliness. So that's what that line comes from. So
Oh wow, that is cool. You can say no, my friend, but could I put you on the spot? Could you recite that poem for us? Is a book nearby? I'm happy to let you go. And
the,
is
the
it long?
book's
Is it
the book's
possible?
nearby. It's a hefty poem. Let's see. Uh, the book is nearby. Let's check it out
Is there
here.
is there a shorter one that might whatever you feel, Jay?
Yeah, yeah. Um, Here's one for you. Well, I said how I was I was kind of a rock and roller, an aspiring rock and roller. So here's a poem called Tinnitus, which or tinnitus. It's the ringing in your ears you get, which many of us have. I mean, it's not an unusual thing, right? You go to a lot of rock and roll shows. So I wrote a little poem about this, and I'll give that to you if it's all right. It's not
Please.
not quite as epic as some of the others. Tinnitus. It's the squeal in my head of all the guitar riffs I ever unloaded into air. Songs pressed so thin I barely hear them, but I barely hear them all the time. A screeching residue from my days of wail and flail, what I get for turning the knob to 10. It rings like shiny things, like stainless steel or glimmers of light on car fenders, like bright spoons in mirrors or a spotlight glaring off a suit of armor. If only I'd been wearing a suit of armor or a helmet of cork. If I'd fired up that amplifier by remote control from a concrete bunker 8 blocks away. Now this inexhaustible sand in the shoes of my listening. They say it's the little hairs of my inner ear broken off, weed whacked, zapped like the tops of trees by summer lightning. I blame myself. I blame Thomas Edison. I blame the lack of elders in mud huts chanting red medicine to the cornflower moon. I hear it most in the sea-deep silences of the far forest, an extra bug-like whine beneath the leafy murmur. Like some dirtball punk rocker I once knew who has smuggled himself into my future. A reeking stowaway from those nights when I was the power cord overlord in a basement crowded with mic stands and wires. Regrets? Sorrow? Don't look back is the most rockin' philosophy, but it stays. It rings and sings like a fire alarm keening inside a star. I'm pierced, I'm needled, I'm prickled and sung, and it seems this limitless aria needs my head to whistle in. That the unshaven angel, whose music is a dog whistle multiplied by the square root of a house on fire, has chosen my skull for his amphitheater. Faithful companion, screeching wind, inner tattoo, unshakable hitchhiker in the big rig of the mind. I leave it behind, but it does not leave me behind.
Wow, that's wonderful, man. I get a sense of as somebody who does suffer from that particular affliction myself. That dare I say it? It rings true.
It rings true, yes. Well said. Well said. Yeah, yeah. It doesn't bother me so much anymore, but especially in Yosemite, I remember in the forest, I would hear like motorcycles that weren't there, and I was like, "What's going on?"
Oh
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
it's that.
It's a tricky beast, but there you go. So what kind? I never even asked what kind of music you play. Was it loud rock and roll? Was it so? You said you went and listened to a lot of blues, but
Well, yeah, but it was the 90s in Minneapolis and it was grunge was happening, right? So Nirvana, Soundgarden, all that. It was a three-piece and I played your basic Stratocaster with the big fuzzy distorted sound, you know. And I put the amplifier up on milk crates to get it higher up so I could get the feedback really well, you know, right there. I just love that beautiful sound, you know. So, and I was near the drums, and drums, I guess, aren't the best for your ears either, right? So,
mm,
um, yeah, I try to do stuff unamplified now, you know, musically. I mean, that's what I like about storytelling. Keep it simple, you know, and you can play the ecology card, you know, the carbon footprint is less, you know, and the connection is greater, you know. So, all those nights in bars, you know, trying to reach people, and there's those bright lights, and you can't really see anything. So it's a real pleasure for me now to bring that same in some ways same energy because you know Asher, it's interesting, like a big hero of mine was Pete Townsend from the Who, and who was not always kind to his own body when he played music and or his guitars, but looking back, the physicality he had in playing music was actually crucial teaching for me. It's funny, in our lives we get these gifts that it seems like we get just what we need, you know, sometimes. And somewhat adolescent as it is to go around smashing guitars, which I've never done, still the physicality of his playing was something I did as well when playing electric guitar. I just really like to just dance and just feel it. So that makes telling stories with my whole body and not just with my words a very natural thing for me, which I'm grateful for.
mm, mm. I have images floating in my head of Pete Townsend telling the Odyssey,
Yeah, I don't
which is
know.
conjuring strange things.
It is. Yeah, I'm gonna have to let that cook for a while and see what it turns out. Yeah, Bob Dylan, I can imagine a little more,
Oh,
but
sure. Yeah, yeah,
still.
yeah. No, that's amazing, man. And I could really feel what you were saying there around the music. You know, I remember Martin Shaw saying that when he first started telling stories, he found himself kind of um, trapped in behind the drums as a security blanket. Like he remembers like the
Mm.
first day he actually stepped out from behind the drums and continuing telling the stories as being frightening actually. And I
Mm.
wondered, did you have the same thing around kind of seeing music as the safety zone and having to sort of lean into the storytelling part?
Well, the short answer is yes, but it happened for me earlier because of poetry, because for me that was the jump, because I was like playing with a band and then suddenly I'm reading poems like completely naked, basically, right? Like just with the book and the words. And so that's exactly the experience Martin is describing, I think. But for me it happened in poetry first, because you got nothing. And then I remember kind of longing for that instrument, uh, to fill the space and to hide behind.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, man. I feel like we're kind of coming to a close in the conversation, but I wanted to ask you more recently. Obviously, with Robert's death in the last couple of years or so, did that, what was how was that for you in terms of, obviously he was a big mentor in your life, and I'm sure there were others too, but did you feel that kind of hole? I guess we kind of knew it was coming for a long time, but still a lot of people who I've spoken to, that marked a real moment for them.
Mm, yeah. I mean, yeah, it was a hole, it's a hole which is still there, you know. Um, I left Minneapolis. I was there right in the nest, right in the heart. I remember going to he had this sort of beautiful garage next door, which was a writing house, and we would sing there every Thursday. And he would invite me in. It was all mostly older fellows, except for me. Tim Young was often there. And they would sing songs, from Sufi tradition. And Robert would be there carrying on and just laying down amazing teachings. I mean, I'd knock on the door, I'd lock up my mountain bike outside, and I'd go in, and he'd say, "Jay, come in. We're singing Blake." And I'd go in, and Blake was a Gnostic. He believed in the archons. And I'd be like, "What's an archon?" So I get this long description. So that was a beautiful nest to be in, and it was with older men. I mean, from where I'm standing now, not a lot older, but I was in my 20s. They were in their 50s, 60s. And but it was a little solar system, which I kind of orbited around and then went zipping out to New York City because I studied poetry there. So I left that, and I felt there his absence, because I'd been right there seeing the guy every week, and now I was in big cold New York City, So this is a long answer to a simple question, but I think I've worked since then to get his teachings into my life and to exemplify them. So I do feel the whole, but I feel his presence when I teach poetry, when I teach storytelling, when I tell a story, and his so many qualities that he had and that he taught to me. I still carry, and I'm lucky to carry them. And so I try to, with humility, carry those things, and that makes it less of a hole and more of a natural progression, which is sorrowful and beautiful. Because I will go too, as we all will, and hopefully something that what I'm doing, makes sparks go up in someone else, so they can carry on the work, which could take on a million different shapes and doesn't have to be another book of poems or the Odyssey or a story. But so yes, I felt his death. I went out there, for the memorial. It was beautiful. I felt it keenly, but doing the work has been a healing thing, and keeps him with me, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, doing the work. Yeah, and not a simple question and beautiful answer. So thank you very much for that. The sparks fly upwards, as you said,
Mm.
and also outwards. And the beauty of this is, here's you and I speaking, kind of as an indirect result of all that, and his work has clearly rippled all the way out to Australia, and as is yours, my brother, as is yours. And it's just an honor to actually come and have a discussion with you. And yeah, maybe even at some point in the future, kind of inviting you into our community where, you know, your energy can really be felt on the other side of the planet. That would be, it just feels like a beautiful thing to me that we live in a time when this can happen.
Thank you, Asher. Yeah, it feels wonderful to me too. And I've too, of course, have seen you in all these meetings, and it's great to actually speak with you. And these ripples go out, and then we kind of ride on these ripples and like actually connect with other people, which is a beautiful thing. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you in this way.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure, brother. Until soon, I hope.
Absolutely. Until soon. Thanks for all the great work you're doing. Take care.